National Security Program here at CSIS, and am really, really pleased to have all of you here today with us for a discussion of energy transitions. This is really about the economic policy and market and technology transitions underway in Germany and the United States. And the reason why we're doing the discussion in this way is we wanted to have a dialogue about what's happening in Germany and the United States, both in terms of the policy agendas to drive low carbon pathways, a transition to meet some of the targets that each country has put forward in terms of its Paris climate agreements, but also the longer term objective to deal with climate change and also provide affordable and reliable energy supplies for growing societies. And we're really, really pleased to have this panel with us here today, featuring Secretary Rainer Baake from the State Secretary for the Federal Economic and Energy Ministry in Germany, who is visiting us from out of town, so welcome. And we hope that you brought this really nice weather with you, and we hope you'll leave it here when you leave. To give us an update on what's happening in the German context in this regard. I think it's something that we talk a lot about in Washington policy circles and in sort of the energy sector more broadly here in the US, but very people really understand what a dynamic set of activities is underway in Germany. So he will provide us with a bit of an overview of what's happening there. And then Dan Utek, Special Advisor to the President on energy issues, known to many of you who care about US energy policy as one of the key officials thinking hard about the policies and regulations we've got here in the US to achieve these goals. We're really pleased to have Dan back here today to talk about what's happening in the United States, what this administration's been doing, what they plan on doing. They are not gone yet, and how that fits into kind of the longer term horizon for the United States. And then I'm really pleased after those remarks to have two experts who think about this from a slightly different perspective, but also incorporate the policy landscape. Martin Keller is the new director of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. So welcome. I think this is your first time at CSIS. I've been out to NREL many times, have a deep admiration for all of this truly excellent work that they do out there. Both from an analytical perspective, but also investing in technology. Martin will talk a little bit about what the role of technology and innovation is playing in both of these transitions, and what we might need to be doing more of going forward to enable their progress. And then finally, Jan Vrenz, who has been here a few times and directs the global energy practice, at Navigant, and is sort of my go-to guy on the cutting edge things happening in the utility industry and the electric power sector. So I've heard him speak many, many times. He's going to talk about his view and some recent work that Navigant has done in both Europe and the United States. So I'm going to stop talking because we do have a hard stop at 3, and welcome Secretary Baake to make some opening remarks, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah, for your kind introduction and also for hosting this conference. I'll start with a little story. Back 2011, second half of 2011, a group of American senators came over to Europe for 2 days. First day, they wanted to inform themselves about the European euro crisis, and the second day, they wanted to hear about this strange decision of Germany of this energy transition. I was there for the second day. I was at that time not member of the government, but heading a think tank. So on the second day in the morning when I was introduced, the American senator said, well, we have been listening now for 1 day to all kinds of experts, and we have learned that there's actually only one economy in Europe that is really working, that's the German economy, and I should please explain to them now why the Germans would want to ruin this economy by shutting down their nuclear generators and their cheap fossil generators. So let me tell you, we Germans might be a little bit strange, but one thing we're never going to do is ruin our economy. And if you look at the situation now, we have the highest employment rate ever and the lowest unemployment rate for decades. So this thing certainly has not happened. I was not very surprised about this question because in my country, most of you probably know that. We had an extremely controversial debate over the direction of our energy policy for decades, and some of these decisions, major decisions, go back to the year 2000, my first time in government, when we, in 2000, created our support scheme for renewables, our EEG. At that time, we also negotiated the phase-out of nuclear energy with the industry. We developed these support schemes for cogeneration. We implemented the European emission trading system. And almost all of that, subsequent governments continued. There was one issue that was always extremely controversial. That was the use of nuclear. But after Fukushima, the terrible accident, then ever since then we have a consensus, a bipartisan consensus. There are only parties in our parliament represented that want to phase out nuclear until 2022 and want to reduce greenhouse gases through this energy transition by 2050 by 80 to 95%, which is very close to almost a complete decarbonization. And we have intermediate targets for 2020, 30, and 40. So where do we stand when it comes to penetration of renewables? It has been an incredible success story. Back in 2000, we only had 6.some% of renewables. Most of that was hydro, had been around for a long time. And back then, we didn't know which technologies would actually make it, which would work in Germany, which wouldn't work. So at that time, we supported all of them. Of course, then we saw something like a technological race, and there are very clearly two winners of this race, and that is wind and solar. And the costs came down dramatically. Somebody, of course, had to pay for that learning curve. It was pretty expensive, and I'm not saying that we didn't make mistakes. Some of these mistakes we still have to pay for because they were guaranteed prices for 20 years. So those installations, 2010, they have to be paid for until 2030. But if you look at the cost of new windmills and new large-scale solar, the costs have come down so much that it doesn't make any difference anymore whether you invest into a coal generator or a gas generator. Renewables are getting cheaper and cheaper, and the fossil fuels more expensive. So renewables already have a cost advantage now, and by the way, much cheaper than nuclear. So, of course, if you have what we have now, way over 30% renewables in your system, and the vast majority of that, wind and solar, it changes your entire power system. Because these new generators, they have features that are very different from conventional generators. They do not produce according to demand or wholesale market prices. They produce according to weather conditions. They fluctuate very strongly. And since you don't have to pay for fuels, once you have invested, you get the kilowatt hour afterwards almost for free. Marginal cost close to zero, which has a significant impact on the wholesale market. So for this election period now, we saw that we had to do actually 4 things that we have more or less completely implemented. First thing is, after this phase of technological development of renewables, we have to bring the renewables now step by step to the market. 2015, we said everybody who produces kilowatt hours from renewable sources has to market that product. Before, they were just feeding it to the grid. Now there's an obligation to market, which of course makes the investor think about how they create and operate their generators so they fit into the system. This year, we had another big reform. Now we don't have politically decided prices, feed-in tariffs any longer. We moved on to competitive bidding. That means we have a bid over 300 megawatts of solar, for example, and then those get a contract who come up with the lowest prices. So step by step, we're bringing the renewables to the market. Of course, on the other hand, we have to make that wholesale market ready for increasing shares of renewables. And that means mainly more flexibility, because if you have fluctuating production from renewable sources, you need a system that is more flexible. You need flexible generation, flexible demand side, flexibility also through storage. So all these rules that give incentives for flexibility and make sure that system adequacy is guaranteed are part of this big market reform, the biggest reform since the liberalization of our power market. And all that also was decided in July of this year. The third important piece is the infrastructure. Infrastructure meaning two things. On the one hand, grids. We have 82 million people in Germany in a relatively small territory. We see the need to build about 6,000 kilometers of new grids, DC and AC, some big DC lines between north and south because we produce a lot of wind energy in the north, and some of our consumers, big consumers, sit down in the south. And that is a difficult task to do. So we decided, first of all, to build them, and second of all, to at least the DC cables, put them under the ground. That's more expensive. But however, cables that are not being built, transmission lines that are not being built, are the most expensive ones. So we're willing to do that. The second piece of infrastructure is digitalization. We just passed the necessary framework this year, meaning that we need to set standards so the different parts can communicate. Second of all, we introduced very tight privacy rules because we saw that in many countries things like smart meters failed because there was not guaranteed privacy rules. And of course, we need a rollout strategy. So we are connecting now all the 1.6 million generators, for example, rooftop solar or windmills. On the one hand, they will have a meter. And then, of course, on the other side, the big customers. We start only with the big customers because we don't see a business case for the typical German household. So infrastructure was the third big topic. And the fourth one is the integration into the European single market. That for us is a big advantage that we have legally. We have the single market already for quite a few years. But of course, for it to work, you need several things. You need grids, interconnectors. You need the software, I call it, network codes, so that the market actually can operate. And of course, if you want all of that to happen, you need trust of countries that this is of our common advantage. We have a clear decision in Europe that every country decides on its own energy mix. We don't want to touch that, but that does not prevent us from cooperating and interconnecting. And we had a very deep discussion with our neighboring countries. We have 11 neighbors altogether, 9 countries that we have a physical border with, plus Sweden, where we are interconnected with the sea cable, plus Norway. We last Friday started to build a strong sea cable. And we agreed on many, many basics. For example, no price caps, free price signals. Second of all, no intervention into cross-border trade, even in times of scarcity. A whole set of rules for more flexibility into this market. And of course, common assessments of system adequacy issues. And since right in the middle of Europe, there were already 12 countries that agreed on many important steps for more integration. The Commission, the EU Commission, is going to take these ideas now, and most likely in December is going to make a proposal for the Europe of 28 member states. So that is really going along. That's where we stand. I would like to use a few minutes to look into the future. I think one of the most important things that happened last year was the Paris Agreement. And now we have a global deal. We don't have to change our targets in Germany, but we have to implement them. And I'm very much in favor of now starting to think long term. We know that the short-term goals for the next years will not limit the increase of the global temperature to 2 degrees. But that was agreed upon in Paris. And the Paris Agreement, of course, means that every 5 years we sit down again and we hopefully then step by step will be more ambitious. But if we really want to make this transition in an economically smart way, I think it is better now to start thinking long term. And country like Germany that wants to reduce carbon emissions by 80 to 95% should think long term, because if we don't do that, we're going to create all kinds of stranded investments. What does that mean? It means that we start thinking about, do we really still need investments into fossil structures that have a lifespan way beyond 2050, which at some point are going to put our society into a squeeze? We either then have to kill these investments. That's bad for those who invested their money there, and then jobs will be lost, or we have to buy them out, which costs taxpayers money. So this is the debate that is happening in Germany now. What actually do these long-term targets mean for investment strategy? My answer is very clear priority. Number one, efficiency first in all sectors: power sector, transportation sector, housing and heat and cooling, also of course agriculture. The second answer is probably direct use of renewables in these sectors, but that's not always economically feasible. So I'm convinced at the end the decarbonization of the other sectors is going to go via the power sector, because in the power sector we know how to produce energy through renewable CO2-free resources. To be more specific, in the long term, we're probably going to meet our transportation needs through electricity. And after we insulate our houses and use the heat of the sun for heating, the rest of the energy is probably going to come from CO2-free sources from the power sector. So this is a strategy that is being discussed now in Germany, and I hope that during the rest of this year, German government will come to a decision for this long-term strategy, because in the wake of Paris, there's also going to be now a competition of countries who is going to come up with the most cost-efficient strategy for decarbonization. And if you want to do something for your economy, I think it is smart to think long-term. Thank you very much for your attention, and I very much look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks. It's a great overview of not only what you all are focusing on today, but some of your priorities for the future. So we'll get back to discuss a few of those. Dan, would you share some of your thoughts with us on the U.S., please? Thank you.
So let me start by thanking you, Sarah, for hosting, and CSIS for hosting. I want to join you in welcoming Minister Baake to our nation's capital, and I'm pleased to be on the panel with Jan and Martin as well. Sarah, you mentioned that the Obama administration isn't done quite yet, and so I hope you and the other panelists and the audience here will indulge me in a little bit of reflection, nonetheless, as well as a bit of a look ahead to the things that we're still working on, as well as the future beyond this administration. I think, if you go back to 2008, when the president was first elected, and if you look at EIA's projections for U.S. emissions, they were projected to increase indefinitely, as far as the graphs went, essentially. And so, that's why the president really, from the first handful of days in office, has worked hard to implement policies to cut emissions, promote clean energy technologies, and prepare the U.S. for the impacts of climate change. So in that time since the president was elected, we have finalized the first ever national standards to limit carbon dioxide emissions from power plants, which will cut those emissions 32% by 2030. For the first time in nearly 30 years, set new, more stringent fuel economy standards for passenger cars and trucks, as well as the first ever standards for heavy-duty vehicles here in the U.S. Set a goal for reducing methane emissions from the oil and gas sector by 40 to 45%, and implemented the first standards to help achieve that goal. Made historic investments in clean energy technologies through the Recovery Act, and last year worked with Congress to extend tax incentives to promote solar and wind generation over the next 5+ years, and set energy efficiency standards for a host of appliances to cut waste, save consumers money, and reduce emissions. And the result of all that is that we're making significant progress in reducing U.S. emissions. A big part of that has been a shift to cleaner electricity generation technologies. I think Jan's going to talk quite a bit about this, but just a couple of highlights there. Since 2008, generation from wind has tripled, and solar generation has increased more than 30-fold. This deployment surge has coincided with and has helped to accelerate significant drops in the cost of these clean energy technologies due to economies of scale, improvements in manufacturing, and a focus on innovation by industry and government. So, for example, the cost of land-based wind has decreased by about 40% in that time frame. Wind power has emerged as a key source of energy. It is now available in 39 states, and wind accounted for 31% of all new capacity added from 2008 to 2014. We know there's potential for even more with advancements in turbine height, longer blades, and other advances. The next generation of wind turbines can help expand wind power to all 50 states. Offshore wind can play an increasing role. We're now we're nearing completion on the first commercial offshore wind project, a 30-megawatt project off Block Island to power 17,000 homes, and Massachusetts just signed into law a statute that will support 1,600 megawatts of offshore wind over the next 10 years. Similar, maybe even more dramatic story for solar energy. In 2014, the US brought online as much solar energy every 3 weeks as in all of the calendar year 2008. Since the beginning of 2010, the average cost of a solar system has dropped by more than half, and all this is taking place while the industry is creating jobs about 12 times faster than the rest of the economy. Looking forward, we expect significant scale up in renewable energy as a result of the long-term extensions that Congress enacted last year. In fact, our estimates are that these extensions will drive the addition of about 100 gigawatts of new wind and solar capacity over the next 5 years, and that's more than double what we have in place today. So, along with a shift to natural gas, these are several examples of important changes in the electricity sector, with federal and state policies helping to drive deployment and cost reduction. We've also made progress in transport. In 2015, Americans consumed 9% less petroleum than in 2005, which is the most recent peak year. That's despite the fact that the US economy was 15% larger in real terms in 2015 than in 2005. And there are a handful of reasons for that, but one important one is the fuel economy measures that I mentioned. We're now in the midst of implementing those, and I think we're seeing that manufacturers are adopting more efficient technologies faster than we expected. And in fact, there are over 100 cars, SUVs, and pickups on the market today from a range of manufacturers that meet 2020 or later standards today. So thanks to the President's leadership, strong state policies in many parts of the country, and private sector investment and innovation, we're seeing significant progress in decarbonizing the power sector and other parts of our economy. So when you put that all together, in 2015, energy-related CO2 emissions were 12% lower than 2005 levels. And in the first 6 months of this year, our energy CO2 emissions are at the lowest level in about 25 years. So this is good progress, but of course we have a long way to go. And as we head into the fall of 16, the President and his team are fully engaged, and a few important steps yet to come. This week's been a busy one on the climate front. Yesterday, the President, here at CSIS, I'd be remiss if I did not mention that yesterday, the President issued a presidential memorandum establishing a policy that the impacts of climate change must be considered in the development of national security-related doctrines, policies, and plans. And to achieve this, 20 federal agencies and offices with climate science, intelligence, analysis, and national security policy development missions and responsibilities will collaborate to ensure that the best information on climate impacts is available to strengthen our national security. In addition, we're working hard to implement the Paris Agreement. Taking a step back, I think it's important to recognize that just about 9 months ago after the agreement was signed, the agreement was reached in Paris, I think some embrace the idea that we should promote the agreement's entry into force well below 2020. Others saw value in waiting. But I don't think anyone would have thought at that point, or was making the case that the agreement could actually enter into force this year. President Obama saw it differently, and I think the US and many other countries have been pushing hard this year. Starting with the US and China committing to join the agreement early this year and setting the goal of entry into force in 2016. And following the US and China taking that step, we've had a surge of additional countries joining, including this week in New York. And we now have more than 55 countries who joined the agreement, surpassing one of two important thresholds for entry into force and putting us on a good path to entry into force this year. Beyond the Paris Agreement, there are other opportunities for international cooperation on climate, and in particular, I want to mention the Montreal Protocol. An ambitious amendment to the Montreal Protocol for HFCs is the single biggest step that the international community can take this year to combat climate change. An ambitious amendment could avoid up to 0.5 degrees C of warming. Earlier this month, the US and China agreed to work towards an amendment with increased and sufficient financial support and an early freeze date, which is the date at which countries freeze and phase down their consumption and production of HFCs. In the last several weeks, work has continued to bring more countries along with this vision, and that's culminating today in New York. Just this morning, Secretary Kerry hosted ministers representing more than 100 countries, all of whom are calling for an ambitious amendment at the upcoming negotiations in Kigali in mid-October. And to help support the transition to HFC alternatives, governments and foundations announced $80 million in new funding. So we're optimistic about the prospects for an ambitious Montreal Protocol amendment, and we'll be continuing our work towards that goal in the coming weeks. I think that's an example, the protocol of something yet we can accomplish this year, an example of an important additional step we can take. As Minister Baake indicated, we also have long-term thinking to do. Under the Paris Accord, countries agreed to develop long-term decarbonization strategies. The administration is in the process of doing that this year, per earlier commitment the President made when Prime Minister Trudeau was here in Washington, D.C. And so we are now in the midst of developing that mid-century strategy ourselves. So thank you again for the opportunity to be here, and I'll look forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks, John. Yes, and I was sort of joking about the administration not being done yet, but I would say there's very few people around town who would take for granted the idea that you guys are going to get some things done in the last few months. So the balance of it may be behind you, but there's a lot of work to be done yet. Yeah. So I want to pick back up in a little bit on the plans that both Germany and the United States have outlaid just to reach your sort of near-term targets under the Paris Climate Agreement, but also the plans that you've got to meet those longer-term targets and some of the strategies you're going to be working on to do that. But first, I wanted to turn to Martin and Jan for their perspective on the role that technology and the commercial landscape are playing in both of these countries' energy transition. So Martin, why don't we start with you?
Yeah. So Sarah, thanks for having me here at this panel. I would like to continue what Secretary Baake started with, because you made this statement, we need to look long-term into the future. And I think this is, of course, as running a research organization, and something where I want to tie into this, because I fully agree with you that when you look into where we are on the I was called the green revolution, so we will see that renewable energy are penetrating. You mentioned how the cost of solar here in the US is 96% dropped over the last years. Talk about how wind came down from 40 cents to 4 cents right now, or 7 cents. And we have just also published a report together with Berkeley showing that there's a lot of evidence that the price even could come down another 30% by 2030. So, but then when you look into this, how do we achieve this and where do we need to go from there? You also mentioned this, that in the power generation sector, we have a good plan towards decarbonization. You mentioned this, where Germany is as one of the leading nations in this area, and I see we have plans also here in the US that we can really decarbonize this area. The last 10%, as you mentioned, will be very hard, but I think there are plans to do this. When you go to other sectors such as transportation, especially here in the US, this will be very hard. As you know, the US is a very large country, so when you look at how we're using transportation and how much CO2 we're emitting there, I would say it falls into two categories. There's the first 50% and the second 50%. So the first 50% in commuting traffic, so we have a plan, we know how we can decarbonize this. It can be done through electrification, we can use hydrogen. The hard part is the second 50%. So I'm talking about ship traffic, airplanes, traffic on heavy-duty trucks. We have to decarbonize this sector as well to keep within the 2 degrees plan. So how do we do this? We need to create innovation to do this. At the moment, there's not a clear plan how we're handling this. The other area is in decarbonization of industry, a lot of process heat. So I'm not completely convinced that we can electrify all of this. So we need new innovation, we need new technology to do this. One of these elements, and this comes down to this, is how can we use some of the electrons and how can we convert them over to something, for example, process heat, which leads to large-scale grid storage. So we need to find new ways, new technology, how we can do this at a very large scale at cheap costs. So I'm not completely convinced that batteries will give us this whole solution into this. So this is the reason I think for innovation. Is this something like molten salt? Is it like hydrogen as a platform molecule? So we all need to develop this innovation to bring us to these long-term goals. And I think on the power sector, this is moving in a very nice direction. But the other two elements or sectors in transportation and also from the industry perspective, we need to bring in more innovation. And even in the power sector, you mentioned the change in wind. Wind is a good example because I think there's a good path forward how we could bring wind into all 50 states, but not with current technology. Because one of the limitations is how do you transport your blades around, how do you build towers when you go higher, which are big in diameter, which you cannot transport. So we need to come up with new technology and new innovation, how we, for example, can produce the wind machines on site. Is the new manufacturing techniques, for example, through additive manufacturing and others, which we can bring into this sector. To finish and summarize, I always make this comparison. I see that renewable energy is just at the beginning. I think we now reached a level where this is taken very serious, and we see this from industry and from the cost. Everything is coming down, but now we need to continue innovation to meet our long-term goals.
Great, that's fantastic. Well, and I want to get back to some of the ways in which we need to think about that innovation process, and because when you look at what has been possible and been deployed over the last 10 years, you have a certain level of innovation and cost reduction, which is great. But then as you look to really transitioning the energy system, you get to a whole new set of challenges, like the flexibility ones that the Secretary Baake mentioned before, that are really about incorporating new technologies into a system that works, fundamentally differently. And how do you innovate for and towards that process when you may not know what it ultimately looks like at the end of the day? So we'll talk a little bit about that. This is a great sort of transition to how the corporate environment and the commercial environment is operating with this policy and technology landscape and what it means for competitiveness. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the work that you guys have done. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. And since I'm the fourth speaker after lunch, it's working now, right? Yeah. Since I'm the fourth speaker after lunch, I will use some graphs to keep you all engaged. Let me see if this works.
You just advance them with the arrow.
Here you go.
Yeah. There you go.
So what does this all mean for the industry, specifically for the utilities? We wrote 2 white papers recently. One was already published on the mega trends and tipping points within the electric power industry. And then the second one will come out next week. The first one was focused on the US, the second one will be focused on Europe. And what's very interesting is, although I agree how things evolve in different parts of the world, from a distance looks very different. Germany versus other countries in Europe, Germany versus the US. If you actually start to peel the onion, there are some similarities as well. And as we all know, within the US, we have differences between California, New York, Texas, Florida, where I'm from. So we've identified 7 megatrends. I won't go through them in detail here, but in terms of comparison, there's interesting things happening in the US as well as in Germany. Obviously similar in nature, different in targets and different in how they play out. Germany, 80% renewables. Mr. Secretary spoke about that, 80 to 95% greenhouse gas reduction. In the US, we have the renewable standards by state, not all states. EPA starting this week, I think, or next week, the questions there. And then what we see more and more, actually, regardless of federal policies or even state policies, we see local cities setting targets around renewables and greenhouse gas reductions. We also see large corporations like Apple, like Whole Foods, like Walmart, laying out very aggressive, renewable and sustainable targets for their organization. What they're doing, by the way, as well, is taking their supply chain, meaning all their suppliers, into that same direction. So, yes, there is a lot happening around policy and regulations at the federal and state level. In the meantime, local governments and large corporations are moving the sustainability agenda forward. And utilities are going to be part of that as well. Power generation, Germany, renewables, we heard Mr. Secretary clearly state that. In the US, obviously, because of the cheap natural gas, this year alone, I think 73% of all new generation is either natural gas or renewables. In the US, we see a lot of mergers and acquisitions because utilities are looking for scale, are looking for future shareholder value. So Southern Company bought a gas company, Duke Energy bought a gas company, NextEra is trying to buy assets in Texas, and so on and so forth. Exxon has done multiple acquisitions over the last couple of years. In Germany, we see divestment away from, for example, generation assets, coal generation assets, or others as well. And I have an example of that as well. We spoke about regionalization. Mr. Secretary spoke about that. Very important. We see regional approaches across the globe in Europe, and we see them as well here in the US with Canada and Mexico, as was mentioned before. And then California ISO is a great example of a more regional approach and actually leading to significant savings for all the participants by moving renewables across a larger geographic area. New entrants, in Germany we see new entrants coming in at every part of the supply chain, including oil and gas companies coming into the utility space. So we see Total, maybe not yet in Germany, but they're going into electric power distribution in Europe, and it's just a matter of time because a lot of the oil and gas companies are thinking about new energy, what comes after oil, what comes after natural gas, which still be there in many countries for 20, 30, 40 years, depending on which part of the world. But they are thinking already new energy beyond oil and beyond gas. And here in the US, we have a lot of new entrants at the edge of the grid, and I will talk about that in a minute. Customer choice, changing demands. People put rooftop solar on their houses. Large commercial industrial customers decide to do on-site generation, storage, demand response, and things like that, and that's driving a lot of the change. And that all leads to what we call the energy cloud, and I will talk about that in a minute. Oops. Now I need some technical support, I guess. Here you go. A very quick example of Vattenfall, which is, by the way, a Swedish utility, but they own a lot of assets in Germany, a lot of coal assets. Basically, they're trying to get rid of them as soon as possible. And this week they announced that a plant that came online in 2015, they're still what they're calling trimming, which is basically fine-tuning. So this plant is 1 year in operation, and they're putting it up for sale. And what they're saying is there's probably better owners of these assets than we are as a utility. We want to be the greenest utility, one of the greenest utilities in Europe. So utilities are getting rid of their generation assets. AEP, one of the most conservative utilities in the country, large coal generator, has decommissioned 11 coal plants in the last 18 months. They're selling 4 more, 3 natural gas, 1 coal was announced this week. And they're building 4,000 megawatts of renewable, large-scale, utility-scale renewables. And what's even more interesting is AEP now has bought 5 storage projects on Hawaii for behind-the-meter storage solutions. So you see utilities making big shifts away from their core generation business to the edge of the grid, to the downstream side of their business, if you will. Another parallel is very interesting between Germany and California. And I took here what we call here the duck curve, and I'm not sure how they call it in Germany, but there's a lot of parallels in terms of having high percentage renewables on the grid, 30%, Mr. Secretary said in Germany. I think California comes close to that. And the same issue. You have power when the sun shines and the wind blows. You almost meet or over exceed the demand. And what do you do in the periods where the sun doesn't shine and where the wind doesn't blow? And that's where storage comes in. That's where a more optimized grid comes in play, demand response, as well as a more regional approach where you can move renewables across a larger geographic area and move them around more effectively. This is the energy cloud. So utilities clearly see their traditional model of generation, transmission, distribution on the left side of this slide, moving towards what we call an energy cloud. In the energy cloud, there's two-way power flows. There's distributed energy resources, there's renewables. Yes, there is still some central components as well. There's electric vehicles that are being used as distributed energy resource on the grid. And it's a lot more complex to manage. And it's a lot more complicated to identify the role of the utility and how they make money in this new reality. This is the shift that I spoke about. We run 3 scenarios in a white paper that we just came out with. We run a business as usual scenario, a grid reform scenario, and an energy cloud scenario. And clearly we see value shifting from generation downstream. There will approximately globally be a $1.3 trillion market, new market around the edge of the grid, the big green bubble, if you will, where a lot of competitions comes in play against the utility, and I will show in a minute who that competition is. But this is all distributed energy resources. This is all digital products and services where a lot of revenue stream will be generated between now and 2030. This is a 2030 picture. The smaller numbers, the bold numbers are Europe. The global numbers are the smaller ones in terms of how that value shifts. You also see T&D growing because we have to invest in a more intelligent grid that can handle distributed energy resource and can manage demand and supply across a distributed energy infrastructure. And Mr. Secretary spoke about that as well. This is the competition that utilities are facing now. They're not alone anymore. We see tech companies coming in this space, Apple. We see telco companies coming in this space. We see oil and gas companies coming in this space, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of competition that is really going after that $1.3 trillion of new business that will be created at the edge of the grid. DER in the US, very often forgotten. Everybody talks about renewables. People don't realize that distributed energy resources this year alone will grow faster than central station generation expansion in the US already. DER grows by 30 gigawatts this year in the US, while central station generation only grows by 20 gigawatts here in the US. Over the next 5 years, DER will grow 3 times faster than central station generation. And that's a big tipping point that really changes the grid and the way utilities operate the grid, as well as the way utilities make money, to be honest. Same in Europe, and then in Germany, it's quite interesting, and these are our forecasts, and I'm not sure if Mr. Secretary agrees with that, but in Germany, actually, you see central station generation expansion. So the expansion on a yearly basis is decreasing over time between now and 2024, and DER will grow almost 2.5 times faster this year, up to 9 times faster in 2024. And that's what's happening with the grid, and that's what's driving the energy cloud. This will require utilities to look at their revenue models, to look at the business models, the way they operate the grid. Because the revenue that flows through the central station generation, transmission, distribution assets will decline over time, and DER will be a significant new business, including digitalization and digital products and services that the utility probably wants to be part of, because otherwise they will have a hard time driving future shareholder value. So besides safe, reliable, and affordable, which has always been the mantra for utilities anywhere in the world, now they have to manage a more intelligent grid, a more distributed grid, and a cleaner grid. And that is really complex for utilities at this point, and they're trying to figure out what it means for their customers, the relationship with the customers, what it means from a regulatory perspective, from a technology perspective, for their business models and for their operations. These are some of the things, programs and initiatives. I'm actually going to skip this slide. And then we hear a lot of utilities talk about individual technologies, rooftop solar, storage, large-scale solar. But what really is important for utilities to think about platforms, that they will be providers of platforms, they will be orchestrators of platforms that will actually bring a value proposition to their customers. And then it doesn't really matter which technologies you need to run those platforms. So an example is transportation to grid. As a utility, you could play a role in offering transportation solutions to your customers, charging stations. You could link a charging station to a local a community solar facility that has storage, but also uses the batteries of the EVs that are plugged in at night to load some of the power back to the grid. So that's a platform play. And then it really doesn't matter which technologies, because technologies will always move very fast and they will advance even faster going forward. But those are the value propositions that utilities more and more will start to think about, and they will become, from just providing basic power, they will actually become orchestrators of energy, transportation, smart city platforms, and bring all the pieces together for their customers. So all in all, big change for utilities, big impacts for utilities in terms of their physical grid as well as their financial flows. They're taking different approaches, and they have to take defense in terms of protecting their own core business as well as playing offense and find new revenue streams going forward to really survive and avoid the debt spiral that many people have been talking about for a while. And with that, that was my last slide. This is some of the work that we put out there.
Great,
Thanks,
thank you, Jan. So very clear that you've given that some thought about what the competitive landscape looks like for utilities going forward. And I think it's a really good note for us to sort of turn back to the discussion about, you know, what's happening in the United States and Germany, because there is a vision for where, especially when you look at the electric power sector, where the sector can and should go from a commercial and technological perspective, but it's not always immediately clear how you construct policies to drive to those ends. I mean, I think about the US case a lot in that if we had one sort of, one electric power market in the United States, then maybe this would be a little bit easier, but it's a fairly complex patchwork. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of similar to the situation you find yourself in Germany, where, you know, dealing with the electric power sector in Germany is one aspect of the challenge, but you also have a lot of neighbors to be able to deal with throughout Europe. I think you mentioned the huge amounts of transmission that you need to be able to build to enable the flexibility in the system that you have that has a high penetration of renewables. It is hard to think about how to transition policies to sort of get all of that aligned in the direction you want it to go in. Maybe to sort of simplify what is a very complicated discussion with a couple key questions for you, Secretary Baake, and for Dan. A lot of people are thinking about this transition in terms of key political metrics. And the key political metrics that we've got now are these Paris climate targets, right? So let's start with, do you both think that you are going to meet or exceed the targets that you've set out in the Paris Climate Accords, whether it's the 2020 or the 2025 or the 2030 targets? And what are some of the most important things that you all are doing today to be able to not only meet those targets, but as we all know from paying attention to the climate discussions, we need more ambition over and above those targets that were set. So what are some of the most important things that you think you're doing to be able to meet those targets, but then also to try and exceed them? Maybe Secretary Baake, will start with you quickly.
My first time in government was the time when we negotiated the Kyoto Protocol. Mm-hmm. And there were some key words during these negotiations, for example, burden sharing. Yeah? Because reduction of greenhouse gases through renewables and other efficiency technologies seem to be incredibly expensive, and only rich countries would be able to afford that. This situation has completely changed. I mean, why do we have more investments into renewables across the globe than into conventional technologies? Mm-hmm. Because the renewables have become cheaper. What we have to understand now is how to organize these new systems, especially with fluctuating renewables from sources like wind and solar. New challenges, but the costs have come down dramatically. I have no question that we're going to meet the short-term targets of the Paris Agreement. I mean, we are joining the Paris Agreement via Europe, as you know, Europe as a bubble, and the target is minus 40% until 2030. Well, our target in Germany is to meet the minus 40% by 2020. We're down now 28, and we are going to shut down some lignite plants and have some other policies in place. And we hope that we're going to meet by 2020 the minus 40%. So I have no question that is doable. My concern is more a long-term strategy, as I pointed out before, because we are at a point now where we have to make some real tough decisions. I mean, why was Paris possible? It was possible because one of the reasons was because the climate scientists had showed us and proven that we have a budget that is smaller than 1,000 gigatons of CO2 in form of oil, coal, and gas that we can still emit, and then we will exceed the 2 degrees. Now, if we continue to emit globally at the same annual rate as we have today, this budget will be used up in 30 years. So my understanding of the Paris Agreement is bend the curve, reduce the global emissions as soon as possible, stretch the budget, and then in the course of the century move over to a decarbonized economy. And it was agreed upon in Paris that the industrialized country will take the lead, and that's why I say 80 to 95% reduction. Our target in Germany is in line with what we agreed in Paris. Now, also in my country, a lot of folks look at these 80 to 95% and they say, well, 95% is for the public. In reality, it's going to be 80%. And the difference between 80 and 90% are my emissions that I cannot reduce, and the reductions come from the others. That equation is not going to work, because if you look at our emissions in Germany and you add up those emissions that we cannot reduce, because, for example, process-related emissions from the industry, you cannot substitute through renewables or through efficiency. You can drive your industry out of your country, then you're insane if you do that, but we don't have an answer for that. That's 80 million tons a year. Mm-hmm. Then I look at the methane emissions in the agricultural sector. Germans are not going to stop eating meat. And so if you add up, eat up would be nice. If you add up all these emissions that we don't have a solution for yet, you easily reach the 20%, the gap between 80 and 100%. And the conclusion of that is that all the sector, power, heating, cooling, transportation, to name the biggest ones, have to be down to almost zero emission. And now let's pick up on what you said about innovation. We know that, for example, cars have a lifespan of 20 years. If we don't want to drive with diesel and with gasoline in 2050, the target for 2030 must be zero emission for new cars that they put on the road. That's the consequence. And if the same thing is true for the housing sector, houses in my country are being built for average of 100 years. Way beyond 2050, even beyond 2100. Now, we have to start setting standards to make sure that these buildings do not rely on fossil heating systems by 2030, because these fossil heating systems also have a lifespan of about 20 years. So that's what I mean by thinking in investment cycles. We have already a lot of answers how to increase efficiency, how to bring renewables into the market. The costs have come down dramatically. What we don't have yet is an exit strategy out of the fossil fuels. And for that, we need innovation, but we also need targets, and we need to sit down with the industry, for example, with the car industry, and say, how are we going to get to zero emission by 2030? It's not our job as politicians to decide on the technologies, but to set the targets. And whether it's going to be electrified cars or hydrogen, that's up to the industry. But we have to have targets. Otherwise, we're going to have stranded assets.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Dan, what about your perspective from the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a slightly different tack on this. I mean, just to your initial question, I think for the U.S., our targets are 2020 and 2025 targets. I think if you look at the 2020 target, which is to reduce emissions in the range of 17% below 2005 levels by 2020, that really came out of the Waxman-Markey bill. This was the bill that passed the House of Representatives back in 2010, didn't make it through the Senate. The 26 to 28, which also had a 2050 target of 80% below. That 26 to 28 is on a straight line. It's on a linear path from 17 to 80%, I think. So I think we're on path to those targets. And as I said, I think that that 2025 target is consistent with a U.S. trajectory to the kind of deep decarbonization levels that Mr. Baake was talking about. I think so. Because we didn't get a comprehensive program through the Congress, we have been approaching it from a sector-by-sector approach really here. I think starting with efficiency on the auto side and also the carbon standards that I mentioned for the power sector. I think it turns out that, and I guess these are all kind of different sides of the same issue, but clearly the most cost-effective opportunities for abatement, for reductions are in the power sector. So I think that's kind of a irrational place to start, the right place to start. So we're pushing there, but also, as I mentioned, in transport, methane, HFCs. So I think we're coming at it from all angles. I think to the minister's point about a longer-term strategy, I think that's essential. I think that's what the commitment to develop such strategies that is contained in the Paris Agreement is about. We're working that, as I said. And so I think we're going to have, we all have to have a long-term goal in mind and a sense of the trajectory there, while at the same time we have, through the Paris framework, really a set of 5-year commitments, pledge and review commitments that we hope will enable the U.S. and all countries to increase ambition over time at each step, which clearly is what we're going to need to do to get to the 2°C mark.
It's interesting. We always sort of juxtapose the incremental approach that has been taken under the Paris Agreement, which I think is, and you would know better, having negotiated the Kyoto Protocol, one of those real breakthroughs in international politics around the issue of climate change, the ability to put sort of this pledge and review process, for lack of a better word, in place and think about policies from an incremental standpoint. I think it's been far more successful in seeing more action on the climate front in the U.S. context. And I think what's been really interesting is this, now that we're making this transition from still having a political process where every 5 years you can go through and see how well you've done and sort of support each other from a country perspective and doing better. But at the same time, we're transitioning to this longer-term time frame where, as you said, we need goals. I think Germany is perhaps further ahead in socializing a discussion about the differences between the kind of emissions reductions that are required between now and 2030 and the kinds that will be needed after. And you're right, there is a huge role that innovation plays in that discussion. And Martin, I was thinking about, you likely get caught up in this discussion, which we're hearing a lot about these days, which is, where does your policy and investment focus need to be? Do you need more money in the deployment of existing technologies, or more money pumped into these sort of moonshot innovation for the future kinds of enterprises? And how do we think about how policy is going to need to transition to sort of steering that investment in the right direction?
Well, of course, as scientists, you always say yes.
Yes.
So, no, but look, I mean, what you brought up is and following also what the Secretary said is, we have also fully agree, is that there is policy has to set the goals and where we want to go. And then, of course, the industry will start the deployment. The question is where I think science, engineering, research comes in on a federal level is to help to show some of these paths. Industry will not launch into some of this research which they would see as too risky. So this is where I think research and engineering from supported through national laboratory and universities and other organizations comes in to show some of the potential paths to move this forward. And then I think as soon as you develop the potential research activities and then you're linking with this, of course, with industry who then deploy this technology. So I think we have to have a balanced approach between setting the policy straight and then working with industry to continue to drive deployment of current existing technology and working with industry to further advance the technologies. Look, a lot of this you see in wind, there's incremental improvements of the technology, but wind industry will not launch into step functions such as, for example, on-site manufacturing. It's too risky. I think this is where research supported through national labs and others can help to set the stage. But then we also need some foundational research because let's go to storage. We don't know exactly what path are we taking. What are the opportunities? Hydrogen, how can we produce it much cheaper? This research is so far out that industry may not launch some of this, and this is, I think, where the synergy comes in between all these three different entities.
And Jan, I wanted to quickly sort of pivot this to you because I think that there is an element of uncertainty that exists for the competitive environment for utilities and the folks that are trying to, envision this future that you've laid out. It isn't a certain one, right? And that's why I think that you talk about it in terms of having a good defense and a good offense at the same time. I mean, I think one of the issues we run into is there is a lot of change that on a percentage basis looks really important and very exciting on the renewables penetration or the DER penetration side of the equation, but it doesn't get rid of the fact that a huge portion of the energy system is still tied up in what is sort of the old construct of generator to end user, fossil industry. There's still a lot of money and assets sort of tied up in that. So what are the risks to the first movers, the people who are really competitive in this space? I mean, what are some of the things that you get when you have pushback on the vision that you laid out? Because I do think that pushback happens in political spheres as well as commercial spheres.
Yeah, I think a lot has changed over the last 3 years. When I spoke 3 years ago to utility executives about renewables, distributed generation, storage, electric vehicles, they all told me, Jan, it's nice what you're talking about, but it's not going to change my strategy. It will not change my business model. It's not going to change my operations. I'm good. And that was the answer 3 years ago. Right now, almost every large utility has a dedicated team to understand what the changing fuel mix towards renewables, distributed resources means for their revenue streams going forward, for their business models. And the good news is they're actually starting to invest significantly in R&D and in innovation. I was in Paris, I was in Germany, Holland, and the UK last week, and every single utility talks about R&D and innovation. So they want to go after the value as well. They're not just going to sit back and let that value be, won by other companies. What's the risk of going first? That they lose some money, and that is in the regulated model. That is really hard. So I think the regulators have to give some relief to utilities to be able to innovate within the regulatory model. But outside the regulatory model, they take normal business risks associated with this as well. They understand that this is not the almost very stable regulated rate of return type of business. It has higher risks, but it also has higher rewards. But yes, they are trying to figure out, almost like no regret strategies. Where can they invest in? Some are more aggressive than others. And I think the early movers will be in an advantage, because I think it will be ultimately about who has the expertise, who has the capability to once these things start to scale, and we're about to see significant scale in other areas, including storage, by the way. I think storage is not that far out. We're talking about 3 to 5 years, which is not far out. The first movers will be at an advantage. The example of AEP is remarkable, and other utilities are investing in storage as well. I think every single utility is investing in storage. I was with 25 public utility CEOs this weekend. All of them are, one way or the other, making investments in storage already. So not at scale yet. They're dipping their toes. They're doing some pilots. They're doing some initial projects. But they also understand that if they don't move, then the Teslas, the Totals, other people will come in and take that market from them. Timing is everything, and it's really hard, and we try to help them figure out what the right time is in the right market, because again, it's different between California, Germany, New York, Florida. The timing of these technologies when they are financially viable is different depending on where you are in the world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'm going to open it up to the audience for questions. So while you're thinking of your questions, ask one more of the panel. We talked a lot about the plans in both Germany and the United States, in the regulatory approaches or the policy approaches that are underway. And I alluded to the fact that both systems are sort of operating, or both countries are operating in a broader system. What is it in particular that that Germany needs from its European partners and neighbors to be able to realize this broader vision? And quite similarly for Dan, what kind of things are you looking to the United States, or you're looking to Canada and Mexico for, both in political terms? I think that sometimes partnerships have really helped unlock difficult political issues in particular countries. I think China-U.S. Partnership is a really good example of sort of changing the dialogue here about what the global climate change dialogue is about and who's involved. But also in terms of just sort of concrete needs, right? Can we grow markets faster? Can you see innovation? Can you do things quicker through those kinds of partnerships? And what are your expectations in that regard?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, let me point out again very clearly that this transition in Germany is going to be only economically successful in a European context. And I'm actually very happy that already years ago we decided on targets in Europe for 2020, and it's almost 2 years ago now that the 28 heads of states also decided on targets for 2030. So the targets for 2030, one I mentioned already, it's minus 40% greenhouse gases, it's 27% share of renewables, not only in the power sector, all sectors, and 27% increase of energy efficiency. So even though in Europe, we say every country decides on its own energy mix, there are certain decisions that we have decided as targets, and there are instruments now that we are implementing to make sure that these targets are also going to be met. And that is extremely important. We might be going with a different speed in Europe, but we are moving in the same direction. Cutting greenhouse gases, increasing efficiency, and bringing renewables step by step in all sectors into the market. Now, we believe that it's not a disadvantage if we move faster. Yeah? We look at this energy transition as a great opportunity to modernize our economy. Mm-hmm. I know that in any transition project, there are also losers, and we have to deal with the social consequences. So as much as I'm glad that Vattenfall wants to become a green power company, Vattenfall means waterfall, yeah. So that doesn't really go together with all the lignite investment in Germany, and now they fulfill the expectation because it's a state-owned company of the Swedish government, and they become a green company, but that doesn't mean that the lignite plants are going to be closed down. There's another company now that gladly steps in and uses these fossil fuels, and that's what I said before. We need an exit strategy out of these fossil fuels, and there's a debate going on in my country now to do the same thing that we did in nuclear, sit down with the companies and the other stakeholders and agree on a plan on how to close them down. That's going to be a longer stretch period, probably a few decades, but once this is decided and it is in line with our targets, that's good for everybody because that makes sure that there's some predictability. And then we have to probably take taxpayers' money to finance some of the social consequences, build up different economies. Part of these companies are in East Germany. There's very, very little alternatives there. So this is a big modernization project, I say, but it also has losers. And we have to also deal with the losers if we want to meet these targets. And that is not only this discussion happening in Germany, it's happening in all the other neighboring countries. And that's why we're putting so much effort into trying to agree on common targets, instruments, and implementation. But I'm not dissatisfied, quite the opposite. I think we made some big progress in the energy field. There's some other subjects in Europe that you know that we haven't quite agreed on.
Dan?
Sure. Just very briefly, I think, for North America, we've had for a long time a high degree of integration with Canada in particular in a range of energy markets, and to a lesser extent, but also with Mexico. I think you've seen this year, first with Prime Minister Trudeau's visit here to the US, a lot of, even better alignment on climate in particular, and some additional commitments there to try to collaborate and continue to harmonize on some of the strategies that the two nations are employing. And so just to give you one particularly wonky example, which I think in part represents the degree of cooperation already, but both countries agreed to kind of try to take similar approaches with respect to, in the regulatory context, considering the social cost of greenhouse gas emissions and what they're doing, which is something that we've started during this administration in recent years. I think with Mexico, there's obviously not quite the same degree of integration, but a lot more, I think, dynamic changes that are occurring in Mexico in the energy system. And so I think just a lot of opportunities for deeper integration there, whether it's renewables across the border or oil and gas or a whole range of things. So I think some great opportunities there and some commitments that came out of the North American Leaders Summit that we're working hard to implement.
Great.
And so, the example of Vattenfall and AEP is very important. And I'm not saying this is a good thing, but I was giving the utilities perspective. Mm-hmm. It's actually a very risky development. If we see here in the US, like in the state of New York, subsidies have to come in now to keep nuclear plants going, which New York still needs for base load. So we've seen subsidies for renewables for a while. Now we're going to see subsidies for nuclear plants. AEP was actually asking for subsidies of coal and natural gas. So it is very risky. And if you then see some of these plants, being sold by large utilities to private investment funds, private equity funds, I don't know. I think that will not help in terms of managing, the assets in a way that they don't become stranded, and in a way that not the customers or the society is going to pay for it. So, I think it's a very important development that we need to keep an eye on, because if the utilities go out of central station generation, fossil central station generation, who will own and operate those plants going forward? If they're not feasible anymore, will they just be shut down, or will they be sold? So there's a big risk there that we need to manage, and that is in every part of the world.
Mm-hmm. If they're not feasible, we don't need them.
Yep.
Mm.
Yeah.
I think the issue of nuclear, which we can get to after taking some questions, is an interesting one, right? Yep. I mean, because there's a very different profile of how Germany has dealt with the nuclear industry and how the United States is, and the approaches that we're taking. And the cost for decommissioning nuclear plants is an active conversation we are having right now, and yet they're going out of business. So at least you guys are having that conversation. Okay, I'd like to take some questions. I'm going to group them because we're running out of time. So we'll take the two in the back. Do we have one last one? And then one right there, okay? So Sungju, why don't you go first? Oh, and please state your name and affiliation and question in the form of a question, please.
So hi, my name is Gilbert Brown. I'm a longtime professor of, good segue, of nuclear engineering. And I've been an energy guy my whole career. So it's interesting, there's so much to talk about in nuclear. That could be a whole topic by itself. There's a lot of innovation addressing the idea that maybe it's not just central station. There are small modular factory built designs that can replace the smaller coal and the sort of the niche distributed source that could plug the gaps of the wind doesn't blow all the time, like a battery. I mean, we need to provide, like you were saying, the base load. when you do this, you should get lights, and when you don't, it's a bad day, probably in Germany as well as the United States. My question, besides this comment, was, it's very nice to hear your coherent remarks about Germany's approach to energy. And you talk about it in two contexts, one Germany and one Europe. And then specifically, Germany is not doing nukes, but Europe, and I'll dare say the rest of the world, does have nukes. So is it your opinion that you can achieve these goals without nukes, or is it just your country and let the French and let the Swedes and let others decide for themselves if they have nukes or not?
And we're going to take the questions together so we can try and hit time here.
Hi, my name is Dan Crippen. I'm a mostly retired Washington has-been. I recently joined the board of a company, Clear Result, that does nothing but energy efficiency. And in the context of today's remarks, at least, efficiency wasn't talked about a lot. I mean, it was mentioned and assumed. So I'm wondering, Mr. Secretary, what role does efficiency play in your plans in Germany to reach your goals? I mean, if you could characterize it as at 20% or 15 or whatever it might be.
Okay, and then one more.
Thank you. I'm Barney Rush. I'm on the board of directors of the ISO New England and serve on the markets committee. So I'm deeply engaged in all the issues of how you actually price and get the renewable power you'd want to see. And I used to be the chairman of the supervisory board of BayWag, which was the electric utility of Berlin. So I'm very familiar with the German market as well. First, a comment, which is I've heard very little discussion of natural gas. And actually, to me, fracking is one of the most important reasons why the U.S. greenhouse gas emissions have dropped. And the replacement with gas-fired plants replacing coal-fired plants has made far more difference than all the solar and all the wind that's been generated. I can't remember the statistic offhand, but one baseload power plant equals thousands and thousands of megawatts of wind or solar. So I think everyone should keep in mind just how important it is. And in areas like PJM, which is 80,000 megawatts, 20,000 megawatts of coal falling off, mostly being replaced with natural gas. The other side of that is what's already been discussed, which is that's driving down market prices, which is making it hard for the nukes to compete. And so that's already happening in New England, where 2 nuclear power plants have gone offline, and greenhouse gases went up in New England for the first time in the last 15 years because Vermont Yankee went offline. So, it seems to me, is just my comment, that continuing the price of hopefully maintaining low-cost natural gas to drive out more coal, but also finding a way to keep the existing nuclear power plants of the United States running is fundamental to the United States achieving its goals. And there is no way that we're going to meet the Paris Accord unless those two things continue to happen. Certainly not looking ahead to the first goal. So that's my assertion, my comment. I'd be very interested in your response to that. But I just want to make sure there's some truth-telling which goes beyond just saying, we got a lot more wind and solar, when a lot more is happening here. And I guess my question would be, since I'm sort of a provincial Northeasterner, I'm trying to think about just how much power is needed in major cities of Boston and New York and Philadelphia and Washington. Does anyone really think that distributed resources are going to be the answer? Or in fact, when you look ahead past our time frame of visibility in the next 20 years, we want to meet those much greater targets of reduction. Do we need to have new centralized baseload zero carbon resources? And that's really what we have to go to, which I think is the point that you were making.
Excellent. Excellent set of questions. Okay, who wants to start? And we'll have to go through them relatively quickly, but let's give it a shot. You, please.
Let's start with the question about efficiency. Efficiency plays an absolute key role. We are not going to meet the targets without a real significant increase of efficiency in all sectors. The target in Germany is reduce our primary energy by 50% by 2050. That's a very ambitious target, but I think without, we're going to fail. Second question about nuclear. The situation in Europe is about half of the member states use nuclear, the other half doesn't. There are more nuclear generators going offline than they're going online. Actually, we have 2 projects, and they're economic disasters. One is in Finland, another one is in France. And so the issue is economically over. I don't see any major investments into nuclear, even though there's one plant there in Britain was just decided, Hinkley Point, but the costs are 100%, 50 to 100% higher than renewable energies now. I don't understand why the Brits do it, but that's their decision. I think there's another point that is very, very important, and that is to understand the wholesale market. Base load is a category of demand and not of supply. Base load is, in Germany, the about 40 gigawatts that we always need, day and night and during all seasons. When in the power market, sources without operational cost enter this market, wind and solar don't have to pay for fuel, they have operational costs close to zero, marginal costs, we as economists would say, then they come first. And that is exactly what you see in all markets. And they push the former baseload generators out of the baseload. So what happens is that these generators have less operating hours. So it's not the price itself, it's the reduced operating hours. And that's why if you have a certain penetration of renewables, you need less and less generators that economically and technically are designed to run 6,000, 7,000 hours a year. Actually, you get into a real contradiction because this is kind of like a capacity that is getting into conflict with your fluctuating renewables. You need more flexibility. You need flexibility on the sides of the generators, on the demand side, and of course flexibility possible also with storage. So this is what we see all over Europe. That's why those generators, may it be nuclear or may it be lignite or may it be hard coal, have a hard time now refinancing themselves because they are less flexible than, for example, gas turbines. So this is the economic side of the story, and I don't see energy security being damaged. We have very clear rules now in Germany that we say nobody may sell electricity that he doesn't have. So if I sell you electricity, I have to feed in the same amount of kilowatt hours into the system as I sell to you. And everybody lives up to this commitment and we hold them accountable. There cannot be a gap. We get those generation capacities that we need. And it's less and less generation capacity that runs 6,000 hours. It's a mixture of wind and solar and biomass and hydro and gas. And that is going to be energy security in the future.
Yeah, so I think agree with the comments on energy efficiency. That's been a big part of what we've been trying to do. I think it's gets less attention than some of the other things that the administration's been working on. Jan and I were talking about this before the panel. His company supports some of the work that DOE does on setting efficiency standards for appliances and other energy-consuming devices. And we set a goal in 2013 of having the full body of that work over the course of the 8 years of the president's time in office have an impact over the lifetime of the devices covered by the standard of reducing emissions by 3 billion tons, CO2 equivalents. So, and we think we're on track to do that. So efficiency is huge. It's always been a big part of the story here and elsewhere, and I think will continue to be. I think it's interesting the questions on nuclear and gas. I think no question that the shift to gas, the shale gas boom, has been a big factor in reducing power sector emissions. I suspect that if you broke it down, I think renewable advocates and maybe some of the environmental community would be surprised by the extent of contribution of shale gas, and I think on the other hand, people on the gas side of the equation might be surprised by how big the contribution has become on the renewable side. But no question that gas has been very important, and at the same time been part of what has created challenges for the existing nuclear fleet. Small modular, the administration has supported that, proposed it in our budgets. We're glad that we got funding for that. I think we're still hopeful that has promise. We've got some way to go. And I think, if you just think about the sector in general, part of what we're trying to do through the Clean Power Plan is just put a framework in place that enables these various technologies to kind of come in and compete against a carbon objective. I think that the extent, particularly that states choose to implement mass-based plans, that will be helpful to nuclear generation, and particularly in merchant environments. So that's yet some ways off, and I think we also are concerned about nuclear retirements. But so I think that we've seen, if you rewind to 2008 or 2009 when I came in the administration and started over at DOE, we were talking then about a nuclear renaissance in this country. The shale gas revolution was kind of just around the corner. I think people were starting to see it, but it really didn't emerge in full force for a couple of years there. So it's been a very dynamic time, but I think largely to the good of between shale gas and the steep reduction in renewables cost, to the good of our objectives on climate.
Great. Did you want to?
Yeah, nuclear will be a bridge fuel, natural gas the same. On distributed energy resources, my only advice would be don't underestimate distributed energy resources. I showed some numbers. That includes energy efficiency, that includes demand response, it includes electric vehicles, which is the only upside. Distributed energy resources, it includes storage. It's going to come faster and at quicker scale than everybody thinks. Is it going to be 180%? No, but it's going to be a significant part of our resources. And what it does, distributed energy resources, it changes the way we operate the grid, and that's the complexity of distributed energy resources. But no, in the US, nuclear is here to stay, and natural gas is our savior.
So perhaps very quick about distributed generation. We just published a new study not long ago where showing that in the US we can reach up to 40% of electricity currently produced by distributed solar. So there is a lot of potential there, and I think it changes the grid, but it has a lot of very positive effects in my opinion.
And by the way, my last comment, emissions from natural gas, I read somewhere in the US, is higher than emissions from coal right now.
Wow, great.
In the US.
That's a whole different conversation.
Which is quite interesting. That's another, that's an eye-opener, right? Our emissions in the US now from natural gas are higher than from coal, which is quite interesting.
And just, we're just about at our time, but I wanted to point out we do have an all-day conference coming up on nuclear power, which is dealing with places in the world that are purposely shutting down their nuclear, places where it's struggling, places where they're actually trying to grow their nuclear industry, and the future of advanced nuclear technologies, which is something Secretary Moniz has been talking a lot about recently. It is, as everything we do, fuel agnostic, but certainly ask the question about where this is all going. And then secondly, we've been focusing a lot on this question of the electric power sector in transition, and how almost halfway through the transition, somewhere between your first graph and your second, Jan, is kind of the worst place to be. Because you hurt the business model for the future and the business model for the present simultaneously. Yep. And that's not a great place to be. But there are some decisions that have to get made to sort of cross the transom. And so we try and investigate what those look like in various regions around the world, and we'll continue to do that. Listen, we could do this all day, but we can't do this all day because you all have places to be. So I just wanted to say a really big thank you for a very enlightening discussion. Thank you.